Imagine a world where every bite you take shapes the future, not just for your health, but for the planet itself. What if our food systems could thrive amidst climate change and geopolitical challenges?
Food system resilience asks, in case of disruption, how easily can we adjust the food system, reroute, and still make sure that we have enough food to feed people?
The truth is, our global food systems are at a breaking point. Balancing efficiency with resilience feels like an impossible task. Yet, hidden within the chaos lies the potential for innovation and transformation. Industrial farming is efficient but leaves us vulnerable to environmental and supply chain disruptions. With every drought, flood, or political conflict, we inch closer to food insecurity. Are we prepared to face these challenges?
What about passive impact? What if you focus on creating assets or creating systems that can make a positive contribution to the world without you having to do the action?
Marina Schmidt brings groundbreaking ideas from agroforestry to the concept of passive impact, offering a path to food system resilience that empowers changemakers like you. In this episode, we uncover
agroforestry is the practice of producing food forests. So you create systems which actually mimic nature. That means you have nuts and fruit trees, and then you have also medium-sized shrubs, and then you also have ground vegetation. So in all of these layers, you're growing food. And that's amazing because
how Western food culture reshaped global diets and the hidden costs of that shift. The inspiring concept of passive impact, creating systems for change even while you sleep. The cutting-edge solutions redefining food sustainability from agroforestry to biotech innovation. Marina Schmidt is the visionary founder of Red to Green Solutions, the leading global podcast on food, tech, and sustainability. With a listenership spanning over 160 countries, Red to Green explores game-changing innovations across 7 seasons from cellular agriculture to plastic alternatives. Marina's work bridges the gap between academia, policy, and entrepreneurship, influencing leaders across industries. Subscribe, comment, and share this episode to help us bring critical insights to more CEOs, investors, and policymakers worldwide. Tune in now for an episode that could redefine your perspective and your impact. Marina, let's talk about the topic of this podcast, food. What inspired you? What inspired your initial interest in the food sector?
Well, my initial interest came actually from a health standpoint. Unfortunately, when I was 13, both my sister and my dad got diagnosed with cancer. Oh. And it really made me question everything fundamentally, the way that we were living on a baseline level, like how we eat, how we sleep, how we deal with stress in our family. And especially nutrition became more important to me because of that. And I looked into various diets over the next years, like during my teenage years. I was trying loads of different diets, over 7 or 8. Paleo, keto, bulletproof, like going in the exact opposite direction of veganism for a while. And of course, vegetarian, vegan, an array, and trying to figure out what actually works for me, and mainly what is the best to prevent cancer or any kind of serious chronic diseases. That got me into nutrition science, nerding about it. And later, while being on a soul search for what is my passion, I at some point also got into the food industry and realized, well, actually, all of my passions are related to food, and specifically not just food and health. Actually, my work nowadays revolves all around sustainability in the food industry.
Let me ask you at the beginning of your statement, the health aspects of food. What did you discover? What did you discover? What truths did you find with your journey?
Well, of course, let's say there are a few basic things that are hard to argue against. For example, eating a variety of vegetables, eating a reasonable amount of fruits, especially ones high in antioxidants, limiting alcohol, also wine. I know a lot of people try to come up with different arguments to make unhealthy products healthy by pointing out that there's one ingredient in wine or one ingredient or one aspect of meat that's healthy. And it's, of course, all about having a balance. It doesn't require you to never drink wine or never eat fatty meat. It's about trying to win the 80%. I'm managing 80% of the time to eat low sugar, healthy fats. That doesn't mean necessarily oil. That also means walnuts, avocados, olives in their whole form. And in general, going for cooking yourself as much as possible.
I'm curious about your opinion. How do you perceive the response from society when you point at this, what you call, it's a truth that you can't neglect? Is this common sense already in the European society, or could there be much more done to make people aware of the risk factors they have in daily life?
I think you get into a touchy-feely subject around animal products. Because we love our animal products. We love our cheese. And I mean, cheese has such a high fat content. It has a very high salt content. So it's generally, we all have the tendency to try to sugarcoat our temptations. And that's very human. And I just like to remind myself, and I also do that with my pastel de nata and Lisbon. I'm like, I mean, it has egg in there. Egg is sort of healthy. And then I just avoid thinking about the sugar and the fat and the pastry around it. Therefore, I very much can empathize with people who want to argue for fatty meat being healthy. And there are, and it's true, there are useful compounds in these products. You can always find something you'll say, but it has a high amount of iron or it has a high amount of XYZ. And what is important is to look at foods as whole products. It has some benefits, but does that outweigh the downsides? And if it doesn't, then that's okay. You can still eat it. We just need to be honest to ourselves that right now we're not eating something healthy and we don't need to pretend we are. We can just have compassion with ourselves. Today, I'm eating lots of crap. That's just it.
That's very well put. I think food awareness of the health impact of food is still very important. You transitioned then to food sustainability. What sparked your interest in this area?
So wait a minute, how long is that ago? 8 years ago, I founded a company in career consulting. It's still running, which is due to the fact that we're working with the German government. And that's, of course, a very stable contract to have, helping academics to switch their jobs and to find their career passion. I was never in charge of any career advice. I can give unsolicited career advice, but I'm not a career coach. What I did do, though, is I talked to hundreds and hundreds of people, because we had, and we still have lots of cooperations with job fairs, like over 20 job fairs in the DACH region. So hundreds and hundreds of people who would be at this transition point where they were super happy with, they weren't super happy, that's the issue. They were very accomplished. They were very successful. They had worked their way up the career ladder. And they had security, status, general like income and everything, like all the basic needs covered, and competence in their field. However, they would get to what I call the ceiling of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. They would bump their head against self-actualization and self-transcendence. So the Maslow's pyramid of needs pretty much describes that we ascend in our needs. So we start out with just the basic needs of wanting to have shelter and security, and then we go up into needs like social connection. And the thing is that people would constantly tell me, I feel like I'm stuck in a golden cage. And I would constantly have people who were our clients, right, decide to just completely switch their career path and go several steps downwards or backwards to start in a different industry or to start in a different career trajectory, because they realize, well, but I need to have something that's aligned with my values. So after seeing this pattern hundreds of times, I had to ask myself, wait a minute, is career consulting my golden cage? And yeah, it was. So after 3 years of just giving my all into building this company, I left and I went on a hunt for what is it? And I had a few areas in mind. It was maybe in the area of health tech, more connected to what I mentioned before, right? The health aspect, or it could be in the area of energy, renewable energy. And actually, I went through different positions. I worked on supporting pan-European innovation, working with the World Economic Forum. I worked in consulting, looked into different industries, led consulting projects in mobility, also in healthcare. And at some point, it was actually a yoga retreat. That really helped me to clarify, I have to be in sustainability. It cannot be in healthcare. It needs to be in sustainability. The environment is calling me. But that's still too broad. So the last thing that really sealed my passion for life was to fill out a spreadsheet. So,
thanks to Microsoft and Bill Gates.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Yes. So the spreadsheet, just helped me with the purpose of my life. It was originally from a friend of mine who's the founder of Klim, which is a regenerative agriculture company. He had put it together to figure out what area he wants to found a business in. And it has 150 impact areas. I added a bunch of them. We also should have it on our website. We just took it down for a while, but we'll put it back in a relaunched version. It has been so helpful because I just went through these areas and I rated them from 1 to 10.
Sorry to interrupt you. Can you send the link to me? Then I can add it to the description of the podcast. Maybe it helps other people. Yes. I've had a couple of people already write me that it was super helpful, because what happened is I went through it. A lot of these areas, I was like, I couldn't care less, like a 0 meaning like
I wouldn't even roll around in my bed for this. A 10 meaning I'm willing to pack my luggage now and fly across the world to work on this. And my 9s were regenerative agriculture, alternatives to plastics, food waste. At the time, vertical farming. That has changed, but whatever. So, no. And my only 10 was cellular agriculture, which is the field that I started publishing on Red to Green. Mm-hmm. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer.
No, it's great. It's great. We have time. It's a conversational format, and I love listening to great answers, especially when they're so well formed like yours.
Thank you.
It's really great to hear how you transitioned from one point to another one. I would like, before we go into your podcast and food sustainability, I would like to ask you one question about this golden cage. I also see it in my environment very often, that people, when they're in their 20s, they wake up to realize, I'm poor. I should do something against it, get a job, get an education, and they're fairly happy for years and sometimes for decades. Then some people have a family, others don't. They make a career. And when they are at this point where they should feel they accomplished everything they wanted and they were striving for decades, they suddenly find out, I didn't find a better way, but I just call it, we don't have a playbook for that situation. Why is that? What's your experience? You said you had a few hundred interviews with people who were in the same situation. Why do people come to this point where they say, okay, it's a golden cage and they need to break out and don't feel accomplished and fulfilled and say, okay, we have everything I want?
Well, it does take time to figure out what is really the area that I want to make an impact in. And I think we tend to be, per default, very focused on doing one step at a time. Like, you get out of uni and you think, oh, how do I make a solid income? And then you accomplish that. And then you realize, oh, well, how do I get the credibility and how do I get influence? And then you accomplish that. And by doing it one step at a time, we navigate ourselves into the golden cage. We navigate ourselves into a dead end in the labyrinth. If I wouldn't have had the luck of having this position at the very, very pretty much the start of my career and founding right away, I'm not sure I would have had so much awareness on that, because it was so in my face. Like, it was impossible to overlook that. And it's not like I had this realization, oh, this is necessary, I need to figure out my values. And then the next year, I immediately found my values. No, it took me at least like 3 years of actively looking for it, going through different positions, and taking time to reflect and look inward. And the spreadsheet, as unsexy as it sounds, was really the breaking point at which I had this breakthrough of insight, because once I saw it, like, with numbers, all of my 9s and 10s are in this area, I just realized, like, how couldn't I have seen this? How couldn't I have already seen that I actually love food? I love this intersection of food and sustainability, like, impossible. And one other thing that was so valuable, and actually, again, credits to Robert from Klim for that. The way that he approached the spreadsheet was, once he had identified his 9 out of 10 and 10 out of 10, he would dedicate a week to each topic to research and to break it down. And then he would see which topic he would just intrinsically want to keep researching. Like, I cannot stop looking up this topic. I just want to learn more. And that's the topic to go for. That's the topic to double down and act on. So in my case, it was in the area of cellular agriculture. So cellular agriculture is also known as cultivated meat. Like it's an umbrella term for different products, including cultivated meat, cell-based meat. It's like, you can call it in many ways. Pretty much it's meat that you grow from, instead of growing an entire cow over 2 years, you just grow what you actually want to eat. You grow the steak. And a lot of people call it lab-grown meat, but that's not really true, because nobody, like, there's not going to be like a scientist with a lab coat hovering over your piece of steak and caring for it and growing it in a lab. Like, this is not how it's going to look like. But yeah, I started looking into that area, and it was growing so fast at the time, and I felt like there's such a need for somebody to come in and structure it, and so I did. Yeah.
I love the twist in the storytelling. I mean, with this Excel spreadsheet, you said a whole lot of reflection, and the usual things that come up is meditation and yoga retreats and stuff like that. And then this sudden twist of analytically. And then I found the spreadsheet. I didn't absolutely expect that. And it catches the attention. It's awesome.
That is so true. That's also a good point. It needs both the heart, the spirit, and the brain to tackle such an important topic as what am I supposed to do with my life, right?
It's holistic. It's holistic. It brings in line the heart and the spirit and the mind. Mm-hmm. It's a good thing. What motivated you then to start a podcast?
Well, actually, when I was like 16 or 17, I remember I stood next to what is it called? A house for elderly people. It was a little park. It was near the place where I was living. I was just walking through this park with my feet in the grass. I was listening to a podcast, and I had this revelation, like looking into the sun. I was thinking, oh my God, imagine being paid for talking to interesting people. Wow. I had this strong sense of that would be the best thing ever. So the idea of making a podcast had been with me for a while. I had started a podcast with my first company in the area of leadership. And after having looked into myself and after having found that food sustainability is the area that I want to focus on, I realized, well, actually, the podcast format would be really useful there, because at that time, so it was 2020, the area was growing rapidly. There was loads of hype around cellular agriculture. It was at a peak of popularity within the industry. And I felt like when you would look into it from the outside, you would, and in general in food as well, you have two formats. You look at a podcast, and I remember I looked at a podcast in the area and I thought, 283 episodes on investing in regenerative agriculture. That's very detailed. Like, where am I supposed to get like 200 hours of to get into this topic, right? And then on the other hand, there were formats, both podcasts and articles, which would just constantly jump from topic to topic. There would be a little bit on cultivated meat. There would be a little bit on food waste. There would be a little bit on this and that, but it wouldn't go deep, right? And I felt very frustrated with that. I felt in my work that I did beforehand for the largest corporate venture builder in the world, Creative Doc, my job was to take huge areas like mobility in Europe and lead a team to break it down into its constituent parts. So how do you analyze market possibilities and potential business models in a huge field like consumer mobility in Europe? You're just faced with a blank sheet and what the hell, where should I start? And to get through it and to actually validate potential business ideas, what you need to do is to start breaking it down into bigger topics and its subtopics. So in mobility, it could be, okay, we can look at it from a vehicle perspective, like what are the different vehicles? We can look at it from a people perspective, what are the different groups of people who need mobility? And then you keep breaking it down and see from which angle can we look at this. I decided to apply that craft and that knowledge to the area of food sustainability. And up until today, my experience as a lead venture developer is the most hands-on knowledge that I've used for the Red to Green podcast. And that is also what distinguished it and what allowed me to get sponsorships like 2 weeks into the podcast, right? Because there's no other podcast that goes so deep into each topic. Like we generally cover everything in 12 episodes on cellular agriculture, 12 episodes on food waste, 12 episodes on plastic alternatives, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
You mentioned, did I remember the right 4 topics: cellular agriculture, regenerative agriculture, food waste, plastic. Did I miss one?
In terms of my passions?
Yeah, in terms of a passion and your podcast.
Oh, there are so many now. I mean, the list has grown.
I was just calculating. You said 4 areas and then 12 episodes. So I thought, what comes after episode 48 then?
No. Well, it kept going. I mean, I also did a season on food history because I actually then studied science and technology history with a focus on agriculture and food. So it was very fitting. We did a season on the consumer acceptance of alternative proteins. We did a season on biotech and food, which is even more niche, even more in depth. And the most recent season was one where I talked with the managing director of a foundation, and we read, I think, 6 or 7 books on the food system and discussed them and shared the key takeaways. So each season is different, and I could keep going with this for years. Like, I don't think I will run out of passion topics, which is also an interesting point for career decisions, because the question that I ask myself is also, can this industry keep me interested for my entire lifetime? And at this level, the scope needs to be at the right, at the right point of zoom. If I would have just zoomed into, I'm only going to cover cellular agriculture, I would have been puking by now. Just every day, waking up, just puking about it. I actually coined a term in the industry called alt protein fatigue syndrome, which is if you've had too much content on the topic and you just cannot stand it anymore, which I have definitely had at times. So it's just like, I cannot hear anything about plant-based anymore, anything about cell-based, like, just please, you can haunt me with this. I'm better now. I have recovered a bit.
There are enough topics open that you can talk about on your podcast, and it will go far beyond episode 48, and you will keep moving forward.
Yeah, I think we are at 70 now.
Cool.
70 episodes or something. Yeah.
Cool. What was one episode or one revelation or one insight in your podcast in 70 episodes that stood out?
There were a lot. Depends on your area of interest.
Let's talk about, for example, food history. You mentioned you did some episodes on food history. What was one insight that you gained with these episodes in food history that's worth sharing with the audience?
Well, one of my favorite episodes that we did was the first one of the season, which is on the history of potatoes. I think how potatoes saved and killed millions of lives. And the purpose of the food history season was to make food history more applicable, because you can absolutely get lost in covering food history. I once listened to a podcast which talked for an hour on the history of dates. And by the end of it, I was like, okay, so the date tree can be used, like the wood can be used to build boats, but like, how am I going to use this knowledge? So the season that we did was specifically about consumer acceptance and understanding the way that we interact with food based on the history of food. With potatoes, what I loved is that it's such a good case for something that's extremely useful and still was rejected for a long period of time, about like 200, 300 years, depending on which area in Europe you look at. The potatoes actually come from the region Bolivia, Peru, which is like nowadays Bolivia, Peru. And they came with the Columbian exchange to Europe. And at that time, you must say that they were also not such a good product, right? If you would create a parallel to plant-based meat, right? The first iterations are not very good. And the potatoes weren't good because they weren't used to the European climate. In the episode, I actually say the European climate was confusing the potato. You know, it's like,
oh, really?
Yeah, it's so cute. Like, think about a confused potato. Yeah, because the summers would be shorter, and by the time the potatoes, which were used to Peruvian climate, would start growing, it was already autumn again, and they would die. So it took breeding, as with a lot of our food nowadays, it took active breeding to make potatoes fit for the European lands, which is funny because potato is the most successful immigrant in terms of food, as we usually believe that it's a native species. If you ask people on the street, like, where do potatoes come from? They're like, oh, I mean, like, they're from Germany, you know. And I was like, oh, no, they're from Belgium, you know. Everybody has like ownership of potatoes. Like, it's our thing, our tuber. But for a long time, potatoes were actually met with disgust because people thought that you are what you eat. And in the 17th century, that was meant more literally. So people would actually believe that they would develop leprosy by eating potatoes. Because leprosy is...
That's interesting.
Yeah. And if you look up Google images on leprosy, you'll understand why. You don't have to if you don't want to be a little bit disgusted. I have done that and I have verified. And or a few plants which cause hallucination, vomiting, or even death. And that is just very much connected to our sense of safety. Nowadays, we think we are so sure about the safety of our foods, but that's something that's pretty novel in terms of human history. Like, things used to be much more shady. And we can be very grateful for the safety of our food system. So it actually took a long time for potatoes to be accepted. It took PR stunts, and it wasn't enough for a scientific institution in France to say, yeah, they're safe. It really took actual celebrity endorsement at that time already. And also the promotion through French fries, or Belgian fries, as they are sometimes called, because supposedly it was originated in Belgium, and the co-development with ketchup. So yeah, you see, like, it's not, if you think about the potato, which is actually pretty nutrient dense compared to most grains, and it's super resilient because it grows in really bad soil. And third benefit, it cannot be, it's not that prone to theft, because if a troop marches over your land, they're not going to start digging out potatoes. They will steal your wheat that you have stored, but they will not like get out their shovels and steal all your potatoes. So potatoes were super important, but they were still they still had such a hard time getting consumer acceptance.
I think talking about the history of the food industry is super fascinating. Also about industry in general. I mean, industries in general are young. They are not, I mean, compared to human history and to evolution, it's about 150 years and not more. And a lot of wars have been fought over food, and most of human history, people were fighting to get enough to eat before it was industrialized. I think also, I mean, when I think back to Europe, I think industrial food was not the norm here in Europe. Or do I have the wrong perception? Even in the 60s and 70s of the last century.
Yeah, it depends all on your definition of what's industrial, right? And how harsh you are.
What's your definition?
Well, it's actually interesting. It's an interesting question because I would say industrialization is very much connected to standardization, to using machinery, to using automation, and to creating food at a very standardized level, usually packaged. So industrial food co-developed with different packaging methodologies. There's a really interesting book I'm reading at the moment on how industrialization created this chasm between cities and the rural environment. So if you think about industrialization, it's a lot about standardizing, and it's very tied in with accounting. So when we try to apply accounting methods to agriculture, we face a lot of problems because food, in the way that it's actually produced on a field, is very, very hard to account for. The quality and the size and the quantity is constantly changing. It's super hard to create a predictable plan because it is exposed to the weather. It is exposed to so many external influences you cannot predict and you cannot control. So it's interesting that accounting and trying to apply accounting to farming was the industrialization of our food system at its core, but it was really, really hard. And that's when being a farmer changed to being an agribusiness. In German, we actually have this distinction between a farmer and ein Farmer und ein Landwirt. A landwirt is somebody who is pretty much like an economist of the land. Yeah, so it's also fascinating to think about the fact that agriculture wasn't always a business. Nowadays, it's so obvious to us that it's all about making a profit. But for the longest time in human history, it was way more chaotic also. And that also created lots of problems regarding famine. But for most of human history, it was a farm's purpose was mainly to feed the family, with a bit of trade, of course, and oftentimes a farm's purpose was also primarily to be a house or a legacy, and not just an economic entity.
Yeah, and people had to work most of the time to produce the food. I remember in the 70s, so I'm close to 50 now, my grandparents had a small farm. And it was what you described, basically a few potatoes, a few pigs, and they've run the farm to feed the family or the close relatives. Basically, this was the purpose. And I also remember from the 70s that not all food was available all the time in shops. And this is why I started thinking when I then had in the 90s, I was about 20, and hit the 30s, I was thinking about how did it change and why did it change? And why did we feel the need to industrialize the whole food value chain? And the answer I found was basically we need to feed the people, and we need to make sure that food is distributed evenly. And the only thing that you can use back in the 70s, 60s, and 80s of the last century or before was basically industrialize it to make sure that the population in our environment has enough food to eat. People who are hungry can become pretty nasty. What reasons did you find in your research for this push of industrialization?
I actually have a counter question. From your experience, like if you think back to your 20s, how was the food quality? Was it actually better?
What was the food quality when I think back in my 20s, late 80s?
And I specifically would focus on vegetables, fruits, the common culprits of industrial criticism.
I didn't make a statistics about it. And I can't look inside what's happening inside an apple, for example, how much vitamins are still in there. I read a lot of statistics that are pretty much in line, so they have different opinions on these topics. When I look at the availability of food, this is the answer I can easily answer. The question I can easily answer: availability is much better than in the 90s.
Of course, yeah.
Pretty much I can buy anything I want anytime of the year. Does it make sense when I compare my childhood experience with my grandmother's farm and vegetables and herbs and berries, homegrown berries? They were much better in the mountains. I mean, maybe it's a little bit glorified. I was 6, 7 years old, and we did a lot of hiking in the Asturian mountains. And when we found blueberries, they tasted much better, like the blueberries I can buy in winter in a shop.
Yeah.
The thing was, back in the 70s and 80s, they were not available in winter. So blueberries, the only time when we found blueberries were hiking in the mountains in summer. It was July, August, basically September. And then they were gone. They were not there anymore. It's hard to tell. I mean, the availability is better. Vitamins, nutritional value. I read sometimes that it has gone worse now, that an apple is not as healthy as it was 40, 50, 60 years or 100 years ago. But I did never run any statistics about it or read sufficient material to make a judgment. What's your opinion?
Well, the prevalence of nutritional deficiencies seems to be on the rise, especially for women, because women tend to eat less, but still have high nutritional needs. So you just end up, as a woman, exposed to less potential nutrients. I think it's especially important for women to focus on a nutrient-rich diet. And a very nice rule of thumb in the area of vegetables and fruits is to go for darker colors. So it's an indication for antioxidant richness. For example, if you compare a banana and a mango, which has more antioxidants? It's the mango, because it's a richer, darker color. Mango versus strawberry, strawberry wins. Strawberry versus blueberry, blueberry wins, right? And blueberry versus blackberry, blackberry wins in general, right? So the same thing applies to vegetables. If you compare zucchini, which is one of my favorite vegetables, with something more darker, like a sweet potato, like a bright orange sweet potato, of course, sweet potato wins, right? And that way of, it doesn't mean that you should never eat bananas or never eat zucchinis. I eat way too many zucchinis. But by diversifying the color of food, we can make sure that we get a broader spectrum. And interestingly, in my area of work, it can be a bit hard to actually even say I'm not vegan in the specific niche where I am working in. But am not weak. I'm not vegan, and I sometimes do eat meat on rare occasions, because the same way, like a tiny bit of diversification may be useful. I cannot tell you 100% either way. And I would just say the important part is to also take time to appreciate. And I think that's what we have forgotten, that if we get to eat meat, which is a real luxury, and it is a real luxury, to take a moment and just be like, oh, thanks that I can have this, and thanks that this animal, it wasn't their choice, but thanks to this animal, and bless them in a way, as esoteric as this sounds, just to approach it less nonchalant. Yeah.
It's a fascinating topic for me. I got interested in health and the impact of food on health in the 90s. And the reason was quite simple. I was an ambulance man, and I saw people dying. I saw men mostly having heart attacks in their 40s.
Wow.
And was a neighbor in our house. He was, I think, early 40s, 42, 43 or something. And from one day of the other, he was gone. He had a heart attack.
Wow.
And I started questioning, I said, why is this one person dying at 42, 33, while another man grows into his 80s, 90s, relatively healthy, and has a longer lifespan? And the usual answer that I got in the healthcare system back in the 80s and 90s was not very satisfying. It was basically, why do you care? When you are sick, go to a hospital. And also when I look at the Roman Catholic Church, the answer was it's God's will, such things happen. And I was more from the side, I said, what can I do? What can I do to avoid illness and severe diseases? And started researching, but not so much in the Western system or in the Eastern system with martial arts. And there I found a lot of people who had a lot of information about what people need to do to stay healthy, basically. And when we talk about nutrition, it was one of these books that I like the most, because it's easy to read. Is Patrick, I think it's Patrick Holford. It's a book, I think it's over 20 years old now. And he made the statement that the nutritional value of nowadays industrial food is not as good as it was 40, 50, 60 years ago. And his recommendation was supplement it. And this is what I do now for the last 20, 30 years. To answer your questions before. How do you see the nutritional value of food these days?
Well, I am not a certified nutritionist, just to add this disclaimer. It's based on that's based on my research in the area myself. I have recently talked to a doctor, like a previously from Harvard, who practices here in Lisbon. He pretty much says at the rate, like the kind of nutritional deficiencies that are considered normal in Europe, in Japan, you would immediately get an IV.
Oh, really?
Right. Because they take nutritional deficiencies much more serious. And I personally do take supplements, but I take supplements based on a doctor actually recommending me them based on tests that they did. So again, a bit of personalization is probably good. I think personalization in food is a bit overhyped. When you there are like these micro trends of like, oh, you personalized snack bars or something, and I'm like, okay, come on. Like, I just eat an apple. But when it comes to actual health and supplementation, yes, it is absolutely something that I resonate with, and something where I recently decided I will have a budget each year. And I think it's maybe like a 900,000 euros for actually just like health related expenses in terms of supplements, specialty doctor visits, going to a traditional Chinese medicine specialist regularly, going to a physiotherapist. Just, it's probably the best investment, because whenever somebody is sick, as soon, and we all know this, as soon as we're sick, the number one thing we want is to be healthy again. Like, nothing else matters. I don't care about an extra digit on my monthly income. I don't care about this or that. Like, health becomes the top priority. And it's such an irony that it tends to be a topic that gets left behind otherwise. It's actually ludicrous. If this is so important, we should actually all have like a proper budget. Like, this is an investment in my future. This is the best investment probably possible, right? Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. That's super important. Also to read books on the topic and to educate ourselves on it, and to put our money where our mouth is. Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, generally, I like sharing opinions on this podcast. When people are looking for advice, they should always go to a certified specialist and not act on a podcast. But I think it's important to raise the general public perception on certain topics like food. I totally agree to what you say. It's super important, especially in our knowledge society these days, where all is about processing information and making the right connections. Without proper nutrition, people function worse than someone who takes care of sleep, exercise, and food. And food is one of the cornerstones of health and proper decision making, in my opinion.
Yeah. And for example, again, for women specifically, iron deficiencies are so common. In Europe, we have loads of vitamin D deficiencies, B12 for anybody who is more in like the vegan, vegetarian side. And in terms of lactose, a lot of people are intolerant to lactose and they don't know it. I found out that I'm intolerant to lactose. I swear to you, I would have never thought so. It would just happen to be part of a test that I did in general. And then I found out that I have an allergy to trees and grass, which is pretty funny. Right? It's like, I work in sustainability, but I'm such a city person and I'm allergic to trees and grass. Of course, I'm generalizing here. It's specific kinds of those. And an intolerance, it's not an allergy. You don't have lactose allergies. It's a lactose intolerance, which actually is funny. It's a very, very Western way of looking at the topic, because the majority of the world population cannot digest lactose. If you look at Asia, if you look at Africa, these continents are just, you cannot talk about lactose intolerance because that's not the norm. It should actually be a condition. If you're lactose tolerant, it's like, oh, you're lactose tolerant. Wow, amazing. You're part of the 30% of the world that can actually handle lactose. Otherwise, you're just normal. You can't. So I would also really recommend people to just get a check, even if you can. Like, I really couldn't imagine. I grew up with cream cheese. There was like half of my blood was made up of cream cheese. It was breakfast, lunch, dinner, cream cheese. Always, on everything, waffles, in soup, and I would sometimes eat an entire cheddar cheese, not a cheddar cheese, brie at once, like years ago. So try it, just test it out and be surprised.
You grew up in Berlin, is it remembered right?
Yes, I grew up in Berlin, but I live in Lisbon now. Yeah,
so it's the German. It's basically the German breakfast, the German cream cheese. Cream cheese. I think it's also in the shops here.
Yeah, it's super, super popular. And you grew up in Austria?
In Austria, yes, in Styria, mountainous area. And this leads me to the next question. Then it's a good bridge. I mean, I experienced scarcity in the 70s and 80s, and from what I got from my grandparents, I mean, they lived through World War II basically. Scarcity was rather the norm. Also, what they told me about the experiences of their grandparents whenever they were hungry. I mean, milk, for example. I mean, today we have really great times. We can make choices about what we eat. When I think back to my grandmother's stories about her grandparents, they just got what they could get a hold on to feed themselves and fight against hunger. And with industrialization, so my opinion is it was necessary to feed the people and to come to a state in society that we have right now, that we can make conscious choices about food, because we have an abundance of food in the Western world, let's call it, in the Western world, and parts of other world. I mean, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to distribute food to everybody on this planet. But in certain parts, we have solved these problems of food distribution. When I go to a shop now, I can eat everything. Not everything is healthy, but at least I don't have to experience hunger. The problem that I see nowadays is that with canned foods, for example, in hyper-industrialized food, sugar, the content of sugar went up. It has some further negative health impacts that we have to fight, which leads me to the next question. I never did research on that topic. Problems in the food industry that we need to address. In your opinion, what are nowadays the 4 or 5 most pressing topics that we need to solve to improve our society?
It's interesting that you mentioned what you said about the scarcity topic. It is a very good point that we need to remind ourselves that for most of human history, the lack of food or the threat of lack of food was a constant. And generally, worries about the future of food tend to peak. For example, in the 20th century, they peaked in the 20s, in the 30s, in the 50s, in the 80s. And like, if they peaked with Corona, we suddenly got a little bit of the taste of like, oh, what if the shelves are not completely stocked full? Right? Like, unimaginable. So it's a good chance to just appreciate the luxury that we have in the Western world, which is highly based on globalization. I've had this discussion with Frank, my co-host, in the last season, because Frank is very pro-globalization, and I'm a little bit worried to a certain extent. Because the thing is, we have this abundance because of globalization. Because in the Western world, if Ukraine doesn't deliver, we can just go and get this from Africa. As the countries, the nations at the longer end of the stick, we can use globalization to get our sources of food just from a different place. But that isn't the case as much for countries in the developing world, which focus on producing food for an export market, but that don't have such good financial buffers to then just be able to buy up all that they need. Because we went from a system where local communities would be able to somewhat sustain themselves to a system that's very efficient, hyper interconnected. There's actually, if you look at the systemic theory, you can look at systems, right, as nodes and the connections between these nodes. And something that makes systems more unstable is when nodes become bigger. So you have bigger companies, bigger multinationals, and the connections between them become tighter and more similar. That's what you can, for example, observe in the financial industry. Silicon Valley Bank has issues, and it creates this domino effect because everything is tightly interconnected. And boom, people do a bank run. And because the banks are operating in such a similar way, they are exposed to the same kind of risks. And you have this huge ripple effect throughout the system. So the interconnectedness of a system makes it more efficient, but it comes at a price. And it's interesting because we need to think about and instead of either or. So the concept that I've also been working on with integral futurism, kind of framework that I've been working on, is all about embracing the and. We do need globalization, yes, that's useful, but we also need regional food production. We do need something that's extremely efficient and tight, but we also need something that's equitable and fair. So it's embracing these diagonal forces that will create a food system which is balanced and that is innovative and forward-thinking, that is fair and equitable, that is efficient and resource aware, and that's also in line with nature and ecological.
Makes total sense. Makes total sense. I think the globalization was a necessity out of the 1980s, 89, especially the end of the decade, when the Eastern Bloc fell apart, Comecon states fell apart. I think communism lost, and the big fear back then was that this whole area in the world around Russia, Soviet Union, China will just drift off into chaos. And as far as I remember back then, the idea of the Western world, especially the Western European countries, the United States, was to support these countries so that they can reestablish stable governments, stable economy, and started trading with them, which in my opinion was the push towards prosperity that we saw in the last 20, 30 years, which also created another series of problems that we have to address now and didn't exist before then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's very, very normal that if you look at the technology history, we tend to work our way from one shitty solution to the next shitty solution. It's like very down to earth. You can just say, that's why it doesn't make sense to pick apart renewable energy and be like, but this isn't perfect, but the lithium ion batteries, yeah, it's not perfect. That's not how humanity operates. You're just like, okay, we're burning wood. We're creating mass deforestation. Damn it. Let's switch to coal. Great. Coal doesn't create that much direct deforestation. Fantastic. Oh, our cities are smothered in smog. Oopsie. Well, let's switch to gas and electricity. We have solved it because we just pushed the coal production further away and we're using fossil fuels still. But oops, we have climate change. Well, we need to switch to renewables. And then we're like, you just keep going. But you cannot get stuck at one level. You cannot be like, imagine like people at the wood stage would have been like, we are going to wait till the perfect solution arises. We're just going to keep burning wood all over the world, No. And all of these technologies are still in operation. We sometimes think about one replacing the other. And that was the case in the food industry as well. Like during the hype of cell-cultivated meat, like I saw a company that had on its office walls, we're going to close the last factory farm on Earth. And I remember seeing this and I actually laughed out loud at my computer. And I was like, my computer sounds old school at my Mac. And I thought, guys, like, that's not how it works. Like, yeah, alternatives will supplement the production. And at some point they will displace it. But it's not like something will completely steal any kind of access to meat that is industrially grown. Like it takes a lot of time for systems to change. And it's, there's a really good practice when you think about the future, like let's say 10 years into the future. To be better at predicting the future, it helps to contrast it with looking 10 years into the past. Or even let's say 20 years, because it's even stronger, right? You think 20 years into the past, it was 2003. And you remember how different your life was. You remember how different the internet was, or phones, or global transport, like all of these things. And then you with that in mind, you can better evaluate 20 years from now how different the world will look like. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Let's look back 30 years. The internet didn't, in this form that we have right now, didn't even exist. I think it was 1993 when the CERN Institute put into the public domain the World Wide Web, which enabled then these follow-on technologies and business models like Amazon. When I love reading. I think it's quite obvious.
Yeah.
When I think back to the 80s, whenever I wanted to buy a book, that was not something that people like reading on the countryside. It was almost a mission impossible to get this book. I mean, we had 2 bookstores in my hometown. It was below 12,000 inhabitants. And whenever I wanted to read something crazy like fantasy literature in English, and I went to a bookstore and said, can you organize that? People looked at me and said, do you really think, boy, I spent 4 hours finding your book somewhere for no money at all? And I had to travel once a year to Vienna to an English bookstore, and there I could buy this book. And Amazon changed the game. I mean, this was for people growing up on the countryside. The game changer with Amazon was making the world's library available anytime in the world and making sure that logistics work. And it's a tremendous change. When we look into the future, I would like to hear your opinion on the food system. 20 to 100 years, and you would have the possibility to model the entire food ecosystem the way you want it to be, and you think it's most sustainable and beneficial for humanity. How would the food industry look like?
The key lever to address are the subsidies. So if you would, in my opinion, if you would address what is profitable in the food industry, it would be one of the most powerful ways to shift things. So here I'm getting also into the how, not just the what. So the what, where it should move is, I'm a big fan of agroforestry. It's a bit of a crush of mine, a topic crush of mine. Agroforestry is the practice of producing food forests. So you create systems which actually mimic nature. That means you have nuts and fruit trees, and then you have also medium-sized shrubs, and then you also have ground vegetation. So in all of these layers, you're growing food. And that's amazing because you don't need to use as many pesticides, because if you design it correctly, there is a bit of a balance in the system. You also don't need that much irrigation. I was talking to somebody who is growing a food forest in Costa de Caparica, which is near Lisbon, on the other side of the river. He grows papayas, mangoes, avocados, and passion fruit, which is crazy. And that's possible. Also rucola and loads of things. Like he feeds his entire family. He feeds the neighbors. He has loads of things left over. He said they have fresh guacamole every day. And you know that avocados tend to get a bad reputation for being water intensive. Well, he actually doesn't need to irrigate his property because he is catching the rain on his property. He's even using the wastewater coming from the shower. And because it's well designed, when it rains, more of the water is flowing to the avocado trees. And because there's a lot of shade, they don't require that much irrigation. So all of this just shows us, well, the beauty of this is that it's amazing for biodiversity. Like on his property, there are actual insects. There are insects. Wow. We're not used to having insects around anymore. Like it used to be. It's crazy, actually. And that's something that I believe could be such a game changer, because we lack biodiversity But the issue is that our subsidies in the farming sector are based on the size of the land. The more hectares you have, the easier you get subsidies. Of course, there are also different ones for having, for actually animal agriculture gets a lot of subsidies on its own. But just looking at vegetable production, for example, the issue why agroforestry is not profitable is, of course, it's more labor intensive. Yes, mostly to pick stuff. But the main issue why it's not profitable is because there are not sufficient subsidies. Because within like a couple of hectares, you can grow so much food with this method, but you are not going to get any good money for that. And of course, you are growing less quantity per product. So it's also harder to sell it to a global market. This system is better for regional food production. But in general, I think if anybody wants to pursue the dream of having a farm, because that has become pretty popular. I don't know if it's just in Portugal, but like so many people tell me, oh, I would love to buy a property and then have my own vegetable garden and stuff like that. Growing a food forest is a long-term commitment, but the beautiful thing is that it does increase the value of a property insanely. And it is one of the best ways to create an ecosystem that also gives back to the local environment. And it's also pretty resilient to climate change. So yeah, big passion topic of mine. I think it's one of the topics that I want to cover on the Red to Green podcast soon, depending on which partner we find for the season. So we usually work with foundations nowadays to fund the seasons. Regenerative agriculture and agroforestry are fascinating topics to look into.
I never heard about it. Can you describe the basics of agroforestry a little bit better for me, that I get a better understanding of this topic?
So the baseline is that we have pretty much the industrialization of farming has led us to create farming systems which are extremely unnatural. You would never, ever, ever see just an entire field, like hectares and hectares filled with hundreds of hectares of soybeans. Never, ever. And that makes the plants so exposed to pests also. And generally the weather and the climate, because the wind can just rush through this huge blank field. The principle of agroforestry is that you integrate trees and shrubs and ground vegetation. Agroforestry is not ideal to produce loads of soybeans. It's not going to be the most optimized to produce one commodity at a high scale. It has a different purpose, and that's also what's so interesting about it. We tend to, when people say the yield is lower, yeah, well, per product, but we need to think about the various benefits that a solution can have. Agroforestry is not going to produce all the needed soy and wheat in the world, but it can be such a climate resilient solution for local food production, which is more important as our global supply chains are becoming more volatile. So when you plan an agroforest, you try to mimic a natural system, which makes it also very complicated. It's quite an intellectual task, because an agroforest in the south of Portugal is going to be very different from an agroforest in Norway, as different as it can be. So it's all about understanding the local vegetation, the soil that you have, and creating something that works as an ecosystem, not just as one product, which in the end is also beautiful, because an agroforest gives you the possibility to have loads of different fruits and vegetables at your disposal. If for people who are interested in the topic, an introduction book to it, which just talks about it from a conceptual stage, so to understand like why it works, is Regenesis. I really enjoy the book. We were meant to review it on the podcast, but didn't get to it because I got too hung up on Monsanto. Talking about Monsanto. Oopsie. Yeah, but there are also a couple more practical books on it. If you just Google it, you'll find several ones. I think it's a very fascinating topic.
It sounds to me like rebuilding nature. So basically moving away from monocultures back to how the reality for our grandparents was, or for my grandparents was back 50, 60 years ago, 70 years, 80 years ago.
Yeah, though I think agroforestry is even more specific, right? Like it's a smallholder farm doesn't equal agroforestry, right? It's the thing that distinguishes it. It's not the size. You can have large agroforests. It's the way that it's designed to be in combination with each other and in an ecosystem.
That's an interesting thought. I have to read this. I have to read these books. I think I just googled it a little bit, and there's interesting pictures.
More books on your reading list.
Oh yeah, unfortunately, this is the downside of the invention of the internet. That all books are available. It was easier 40 years ago. You mentioned Monsanto. What caught your attention with this company?
Yeah, well, I used to have a bit of a thing for true crime. And if you're into true crime, there's plenty of true crime to be had with Monsanto. Monsanto is a company that started out in the seed business, actually in the pesticide area. Well, if you look back at their very, very beginnings, they were, for example, one of the largest providers of, I think, saccharose for Coca-Cola. And then they got into pesticides, and they became a seed company by creating genetically modified seeds. And they were also pretty much the key pillar in creating such a bad reputation for GMOs. Because the purpose of the genetically engineered crops would be to resist glyphosate use. So glyphosate is the most used weed killer in the world. And it's so potent that if you spray it anywhere, it interferes with the metabolism of plants. So it just kills everything, which led to Roundup, the product. So Roundup is the entire formulation, and then you have glyphosate as the one of the ingredients, sometimes not even the main ingredient, which led to wait a minute, I lost my train of thought. So you pretty much Monsanto was making its money selling Roundup, but farmers could only use it before seeding or after the harvest because it would kill everything. Ta-da! If you genetically engineer the plants to be resistant to glyphosate, then you can spray it on your plants and it kills everything but your plants. The thing is, from a farmer's perspective, this is extremely useful, which is also why Monsanto became one of the largest seed players. It got into the seed business and it just took it over. It is useful. It has a purpose, and that's why I always try to not be black and white with these things. Like, there are benefits to this. And it definitely contributed to a decrease in prices of soy and so on. But of course, there is also the issue of higher pesticide contamination if you're suddenly able to just spray this thing on your plants. And the main issue with Monsanto is that they, for a long time, were pretending that this is just super harmful. They were pretending that it's not harmful. They're just like, oh yeah, sure, you can just spray it in your garden. You don't even need to wear protective shoes. Mm-hmm. You can just be like in flip-flops, just like, oh yeah, I just spray my plants, right? To get rid of weeds. But it is more, there is enough research by now that it is more harmful than Monsanto pretended it is. There have been a lot of litigations in the US, especially people suing Monsanto for claiming it's non-carcinogenic, but then developing non-hop. I may butcher the name. It's a specific type of cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, I think, and winning these lawsuits. So Bayer, a German pharmaceutical company, bought Monsanto. And then also Bayer's share price really took a hit after buying Monsanto because the litigations just kept flooding in. I was very interested in this topic. I looked a lot into it. It still makes my heart sink a little bit, and it makes my gut feel a little bit nauseous, this entire field. It was also the first time in the history of the Red to Green podcast, which is by now 4 years old, that I had to actually ask a lawyer to write me a disclaimer to not be sued. And again, I'll have to add a disclaimer. These are just my personal opinions, and maybe I'm just making satire, and this is all not serious. I have no idea about anything. I don't know. I'm just sharing my opinions of Monsanto, which are totally non-founded. Don't sue me, please. Thanks. So it's a serious topic to address, and in the end, it doesn't make sense to eat less vegetables or fruits being afraid of being exposed to pesticides. It's pretty much like trying to earn less money because you're afraid of paying taxes. just earn money. Don't worry about the taxes, please. Just earn your money.
That's a good point.
So eat your vegetables. Don't worry about the pesticides. Of course, wash your stuff, right? But it should never keep you from eating a carrot.
I totally agree. I think there's also a huge difference between the US and the European markets. When I think back about my trips to Canada, the behavior of people, and when I compare it with Austria and the quality of food we have in Austria, I think this is one good thing in Austria, that our politicians take care that we have good standards and good regulations, which sometimes is necessary. I worked in the food industry 20 years ago, in the sugar industry. The thing is, with intention, when I look at the health perspective of sugar, sugar is one of the major reasons of increasing cancer, in my opinion. Sugar is everywhere, in all kinds of foods, and people just eat too much. Is this the intention of the sugar industry? I'm not so sure, because the upside of sugar, for example, is that you can preserve food, and you can make sure that people have enough access to food at all times of the year, which was not the norm a couple of decades ago. The overconsumption, is this the responsibility of the industry, or is it the responsibility of people, or is it the responsibility of politicians? How should we tackle such problems? What do you think? How should we tackle situations like Monsanto, or these overly sugary products that we have now on the shelves? Should we put the responsibility with the people and say, politicians and industry has to provide food, but it's your responsibility to make the right choices? How should we tackle these situations? How should we solve them?
Well, I think these are two separate pathways, right? You have the overconsumption topic, and then you have the actual food health standards in terms of toxicology. What are the kind of amounts of pesticide residues that we allow? What are the kind of pesticides in general that we allow? A lot of the pesticides that are still legal in the US are long time banned in Europe. So Europe in the food industry, right, from an internal perspective also, I've recently was at a conference on regulation in Europe. Oh, and it's actually it was a worldwide regulation conference based in Spain, talking about regulatory approvals of novel food products. Europe is seen as the hardest place to get approval because it's a strict market. And as a company that's trying to push innovation, that's something that is often criticized, like, Europe is so slow with the regulatory approval. And these criticisms are also reasonable because oftentimes it's based on bureaucracy rather than actual safety. That's one part. And it's also a cultural decision because in Europe, it's not just about the safety, it's also about the member states with a majority approving the introduction of a novel food. But I'm digressing. So if you compare the US and Europe, you can see that the pesticides that are approved are much more stringently controlled in Europe. If you look at overconsumption, if you believe that the way that people eat is all based on personal willpower, then you would have to assume that Americans have just generally lower willpower. And by now also the UK, because the UK and the US are a bit more similar in terms of their consumption habits by now. So of course, people have a personal say, but we tend to underestimate how strongly we are influenced by marketing, by advertisement, by the kind of availability of food. If you are in the US, it's so much harder to get affordable, healthy food. Again, something we can be very grateful for in Europe, I think. Like, I remember once I was at a supermarket and I bought loads of vegetables and tubers and cabbage, and it was just 2 big bags. And it ended up, I still remember, it was 33 euros and like 14 cents or something. And the woman behind me, she actually was, and that's unusual because in Germany, we usually don't make comments. If it's comments, then it's like negative complaints, right? But she's like, oh my God, like, wow, that's so cheap and so much food. Because I was just buying mostly vegetables and fruits, which are unprocessed and which are, fortunately, in our region, cheaper than most processed stuff. And that's such an incentive. So I think it is policy action that's also super important to drive these behaviors that supports positive behaviors. We, in the Western world, we think we are just individuals and it doesn't matter where we live and it doesn't matter in what kind of political system. We are just doing our thing and we are making our decisions and we are so independent. But if you look at it, comparing different countries to each other and the consumption habits, you realize like, wow, there's a lot of influence through our system, and the globalization has created something that is somewhat of a global standard diet. Wheat has become so prevalent, which wheat is not very nutrition dense, especially in like white processed form, right? We have replaced a lot of regional traditional diets, which were maybe more specific, but sometimes also more healthy, with a more Western approach, a pretty like Americanized food system. And I think in Europe, it's still there's a lot of cultural heritage. So we tend to be proud of our different food traditions, and we tend to hold on to that. And it's a lovely thing, actually.
Why? What's your opinion? Why did that happen? This Americanization of the food industry, let's just call it that way. I mean, with McDonald's, Burger King, industrialized food, canned food. Price-wise, I mean, there's no logic. Whenever I decide to just stay away from hyper-processed, highly processed food and I just buy vegetables, I'm always surprised how cheap it is here in Austria. I don't know if it's everywhere in Europe, but at least in Austria it is. I think it's 50% less, and can cook vegetable soups, and it's pretty quick and super healthy, super cheap. So there is no reason to go to McDonald's, and there is no reason to go to on a daily basis. I mean, sometimes having a burger is a good thing. It's fun. It tastes good. It's good to eat. But why was there so much? Why do so many people choose consciously or subconsciously to stay with highly processed foods when they have other choices available? What's your opinion on that? Why did it happen?
Well, we had a really interesting podcast episode. I just looked it up. It was like 5.11 on how China became the second largest dairy market in the world. It's one of the most listened to favorite podcast episodes of Red to Green, because it is quite a gripping story. China is primarily comprised of lactose intolerant people, or the normal lactose intolerant people. It's about like 93% or so of their population cannot digest lactose. So it's, if you look at the statistic that it has been the second largest dairy market, and it's on the trajectory to become the largest dairy market, of course, that is driven by a huge population. But still, it is actually crazy that the prime ministers in the past, one of the prime ministers in 2005 was saying, we want to make people eat the equivalent of like 300 grams of dairy a day, which is, I think, the same or even a bit higher than in the US. It was even driven by a political initiative, right? It's the Communist Party that was promoting dairy in schools, that was supporting dairy farmers in China, that was supporting imports. So you would have to think, you look at this and you're like, that doesn't make any sense. Your population is lactose intolerant. Why are you spending all this money and PR to promote a Western diet, which is dairy-based, in China? And in this case, it's also connected to the halo of the Western world. Right? So when Starbucks and McDonald's opened up in China, they brought, for example, Starbucks brought coffee culture to China. And we know Starbucks is very dairy-based. These chains are very associated with modernism. And China has had a very severe history of famine, mass famines in the past, unfortunately. So as part of there was the sense that Chinese are a bit weaker. And actually, it feels a little bit edgy for me to say this, because of course I'm not Chinese, and that's why in the episode I'm actually quoting an expert on this from China, to make sure I'm actually just quoting him. These are not my words, right? But the baseline is that with the Olympic Games, I lost the year. I think it was in the end of the 20th century, when the first time Olympic Games were shown in China. It made a huge impression on the population, because the Chinese would see Western athletes which seem to be so much stronger and taller. And the idea was, ooh, maybe it's dairy. And to an extent, dairy consumption does seem to correlate with height, increased height. It's a very dense food, and you could maybe get into the territory of arguing, well, it also increases growth hormones. So it may, during a specific time when growing up, increase your height due to that. So because there is such a connection between dairy, the Western world, strength, that led the Chinese Communist Party to promote dairy, to say, look, we have this one-child policy, but that one offspring that you're going to have, we're going to feed it well. They're going to get the best nutrients. They're going to have milk powder, proper dairy, so they grow up being big and strong. It's up till this day, I think it's the most perplex, weird case study of a westernization of a food system that was actually much better before. Like, breast cancer rates were extremely low in China, and there was a rise of breast cancer rates with the introduction of dairy, right? And it just doesn't serve their bodies, just like it doesn't serve mine, even though I'm European. It's just one example where we need to consider the cultural effect and the political narrative and the belief that West is modern and modern is good.
Yeah, coming from a times of scarcity, I think China also had some tough times in the last century, before 89. Many can understand from what you say, can understand the politicians when they say, okay, we don't want to go back to times of scarcity and want to see our people suffer. And when it looks like Europe and the United States have solved the problems with food availability, why not copy it? Why not just copy it? You mentioned the Olympic Games. I think you were talking about 2008. Is that right? 2008 Games.
Yes, 2008.
I just looked it up.
That was, but was that really the first time? That's insane.
I don't know. I did a quick research and I saw 2022 Winter Olympics and 2008.
But that's when they were hosted in Beijing.
Mm.
Okay, but that's true. But then the first time it was aired, the first time the Chinese were exposed to this was earlier. And then they were hosted in Beijing, which a lot of the Chinese dairy producers used to promote themselves. Pretty much some of the Chinese dairy companies were actually funding the Olympics and like associating themselves with the Olympics.
So we are talking about the time before 1989, basically before
yes.
Okay. Yeah, no, totally makes sense. Totally makes sense to think. I think. Go ahead.
And another really interesting point is when Nixon visited China, they gifted him a candy called White Rabbit, and it's made of dairy. Like, just think about this. Like, a president from the US visits your country, you're gifting him a dairy candy. Like, that just shows you the kind of status that dairy developed in China, the kind of reputation that you gift this to a president. Wild to me.
When I remember the history of China, right, I think before World War II and in World War II, they were target of occupation. So there was a lot of war. Japan, I think also United States, Western countries involved in that. And I think one decision of the politicians was to have more children, to have a larger population. And with that comes the problem, you have to feed them. And so in this context, it makes sense basically to switch to an industry where you think other regions of the world have a competitive advantage when it comes to warfare and security of a country.
Yeah, though it's interesting because a lot of the dairy consumption of China is imported. And in general, animal agriculture is pretty intensive, right? So, and there's a difference. I would really separate primarily two kinds of animal agriculture. If you think about grasslands, which are very prevalent, for example, in Northern Europe, they tend to be unproductive because we humans cannot digest grass. So it totally makes sense to have a ruminant, a cow, digest the grass and produce meat and dairy, which is available for human consumption, gives human calories. And there's a concept called circular animal agriculture, where you pretty much would argue we should have as much agriculture as can actually be sustained by local grasslands. But the main problem with animal agriculture is that this just makes up a tiny slither of it, because most of our industrial agriculture is fed by monocrop soy brought in from Brazil, which and general Latin America, which creates a deep imbalance in nutrients. Like you bring in all these nutrients, they're eaten by our industrialized cows, and then you have a huge issue with over-fertilization, which just too much of a good thing is not good, right? If you would just slather your houseplants in fertilizer, you just dump fertilizer on them, not good. The same holds true with our local ecosystem. So when we think about when people are like, yeah, but like there can be carbon neutral beef and I'm like, well, like even if we would assume that that's the case, that the storage of CO2 in the soil is unlimited and it just exponentially grows till for eternity, even then you cannot do that at the rate of consumption that we have right now. It's not possible. And that's why I would say, of course, people can have their meat, but it's fine. And I'm not a proponent of shaming people for their choices. I think that's unproductive. And we also don't need to be perfectionistic. People don't have to be hardcore vegans and in a competition who can last longer for years and years. But the thing that we need to focus on is to sort of go back to appreciating eating meat, making it something special, like, a Sunday roast used to be a special thing. Nowadays, we just think that eating meat on a daily basis, or even like sometimes people are like, oh yeah, I'm going to try to have a meal without meat. That is a highly, highly untypical consumption pattern. And that's not necessary. We need to find a bit of a balance. And what helps is to have alternatives, which is why there are plant-based products in development, which is why we have approaches like precision fermentation or cell-cultivated meat in the pipeline to give us the pleasure of eating dairy products or meat products and while also offering us the possibility of doing it without ruining our planet or ruining it less. Like not even that. Again, like working from shitty solution to less shitty solution, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Following that theme.
We have to improve the food system. There's a lot. There are many important parts in what you just said. One was that having this Sunday roast or this special treatment on a special day of the week, it was quite the norm before the 90s. The availability of food was not so good like it is now. We're now living in a world of abundance. And whenever I think back or when I buy meat at the grocery store, I have this picture of the 70s and 80s in my mind of happy chickens, happy pigs, happy cows. And then I learned in the last years that it's not the case anymore. And this is what drives me away from eating meat, is just thinking about the conditions these animals have to endure in their short life. It's just, it disgusts me. So it's, on one hand, ethically, morally, I think it's wrong. It's just wrong to do that to a living creature. The second thing is it's not healthy. I mean, you mentioned soy, that they eat not really what I would call healthy nutrition for animals. And I mean, what's the quality of the meat then when people eat that? What is the effect in their metabolism? I think there is much more research that needs to be done in this area to analyze the health effects, the downstream effects of eating industrialized meat. And also from an ethical standpoint, I think there is enough groundwork that needs to be done. But what's the solution in your opinion? I mean, on one hand, I understand there is a need to feed the people. On the other hand, it should be high quality. Do you think that we will ever reach this balance of high quality food for everybody on this planet at an affordable price?
I mean, it's a high mark. It's a high attempt in the food industry. The classic thesis, the classic worry that's slapped on loads of presentation is, how do we feed 10 billion people by 2050? You come across it all the time as being in the food industry. So in this case, we worry first and foremost about quantity, which this approach can criticize from various standpoints. You could look at it from an egalitarian standpoint and say, well, actually, we have enough food, we just aren't sharing it, or from what I call a modern Malthusian standpoint, that we have enough food, but we are distributing it inefficiently. Like, we are wasting too much of it. We are not producing in an integrated manner. We're not tracing it properly. Will we get to a point that globally we will have good nutrition? I think at this very moment, the priority in the food system is actually, how do we make it climate resilient? And so you work on two levels, right? You need to think about how can we contribute less to the global warming, and then how do we prepare the system to deal with the climate change and the extreme weather. So in the past, especially in the past 2 years, food system resilience became a trend topic. It shifted a little bit from food system sustainability to food system resilience, which is the hot topic right now.
What is food system resilience?
Food system resilience refers to, if there's a drought, if there's a flooding, will it destroy the farm? Will it destroy the year's harvest? So you can look at it on several levels, right? You can look at it on the farm level and say, how resilient are farms to extreme weather events? Then you can look at it on a supply chain level and say, how resistant are our supply chains in terms of disruptions? And these could be geopolitical disruptions, like wink, wink, any kind of important transport passages being blocked due to various reasons. Or it could be extreme black swan events, how you call them, like Corona or war, right? Food system resilience asks, in case of disruption, how easily can we adjust the food system, reroute, and still make sure that we have enough food to feed people? So in the West, as I mentioned before, right, we tend to be at the longer end of the stick, so we are not experiencing these effects as much. But in the developing world, you can experience the increasing issues of regard related to food system resilience much stronger. So the reports on lack of harvests due to bad weather events are coming in left and right, but we just are not yet noticing it as much in the Western world, even though we are starting to. If you look at the summer droughts in Italy and Spain, right, the water scarcity that's already leading to certain regions in Spain having to restrict private pools, topics like that. It's getting there.
It's fascinating. A lot of work that needs to be done. I have listeners in the realm of startups and investment. What advice would you give them when they are interested to starting something or investing in the food industry? What are the pressing problems they should focus on?
Well, that's the thing, like if you're starting something, right, it's all about the timing and whether you want to build a VC-backed business or not. The area of alternative proteins has been super popular for the past couple of years, and it has lost a bit of its steam in the past year or so, 2 years especially. Alternative proteins refers to various ways to produce animal replacement products, dairy-free cheeses, or also, as I mentioned, meat grown from cells. It's still trendy. It's still an area you can look into. I think as somebody who wants to do something about it, you can either look at it as volunteering in your local food bank or getting engaged with your farmers, connecting with your farmers more, like just building your personal relation to your local food system. Or you can actually look at it in terms of getting involved, for example, with policy, like joining a nonprofit in the area that tries to support positive policies related to food. That's something that you can do as a citizen. Of course, your own consumption you can look at, but because you were specifically asked in terms of professionals, there's so much. The food system is deeply intriguing, and I think for a lot of people, once they get into it, they find enough to do. There's enough to do. Like, first of all, you will not run out of things to do that you do in the food system. I think in my podcast, I've covered many, many different angles that you can take, from food waste to plastics to biotech. And there are many more. I don't know how helpful that answer was.
Absolutely. It's super fascinating talking to you. And it looks like there is a lot of work that needs to be done. And we just covered the tip of the iceberg, not even the tip of the iceberg, just a little.
Just scratched it with a little toothbrush.
Maybe not even that. This is such a huge topic and such an important topic. I think feeding everybody, making sure it's nutrient dense, and it's also healthy and available, but also embraces the human nature. So not having any kind of food every time, and also restricting eating to certain time windows to not have downstream problems with health like diabetes, obesity that we see nowadays. It's just huge. It's just huge. And you're really well informed. I really enjoy this conversation. I just checked the time and we are close to 2 hours, and it went by like nothing. My question to you is there any topic open at the end of this podcast that we should address in your opinion?
Well, I'm currently starting to work on a grant that supports film directors to look at the topic or feature the topic of food sustainability. And I think one of my current passion topics is that I think you can support policy at the right time with the right kind of awareness raised in the general consumer market, but also actually by educating people in the parliament or the commission with like interesting short films that cover why these topics are important. And if we look at a lot, so pretty much I was connected with a film director to create a film festival on food sustainability. And we looked at the field and we realized the issue is there are a lot of films which are very negative. And it's very easy to point out the problems. But it's very hard to suggest solutions. So that's a big white space that I see, which I'm trying to fill with the most likely it will be a nonprofit that we are starting to connect philanthropic money from foundations to film directors who can cover relevant topics. So if anybody is working in the nonprofit space and wants to have a chat about that and talk about how film can help support sustainable policy, I'm very happy to have a talk.
Super. No, absolutely. Do you have a link to this project when somebody is interested in that area with more information, and also how giving information how to best reach you?
Yeah, so we will be working on the website soon. Right now, we are in the launch phase, starting to talk to foundations about the topic. Depending on when the podcast is published, we may have a website by then.
So we're live right now. I could put it also in the comments and description of the live stream. I just will keep the live stream online, and I think the podcast 3 or 4 weeks, I would say.
Okay. Well, I will give you the link for the podcast episode.
This would be great. Yeah. Final question from my side. We are at the end of 2023, and we are at the beginning of 2024. Which goals do you have for 2024?
Personally,
business, whatever you choose.
Well, I'm also starting to produce a podcast in collaboration with an institution from the German government, so funded by the German government, also in the same area of food sustainability and how our food system needs to change. So Red to Green has become an agency, and I'm planning to use that kind of approach to produce more deep content. I like the term deep tech. It's so trendy, right? And the specialty that I have is deep content. I love to dig and dig and dig deeper into rabbit holes. So that podcast agency, which is focused on impact-driven deep content, that's one. And keep building the team, keep building a network of media relations there to make sure the content is spread well. And the nonprofit, so the film grant that I just described, that's a big passion of mine. And it's where I see a huge white space in the area and the opportunity to have a huge impact. My co-founder there, she, as a film director, she has worked with Greta Thunberg. And she also works with George Monbiot, who's the author of Regenesis, the book that I recommended to you. And her last short film with Greta Thunberg reached 85 million impressions over loads of different channels. I love the concept of passive impact, which is something I came up with years ago. Tim Ferriss is a very popular figure in like the startup world, and he talks about passive income, which is if you create systems and companies that make money while you can be asleep, right? And I liked that idea, but I somehow felt it was a little selfish, like self-centered at times, the way that it's presented or the way that it's used. So I thought about this idea. What about passive impact? What if you create, if you focus on creating assets or creating systems that can make a positive contribution to the world without you having to do the action? So, an example, instead of I'm going to the beach and I'm going to pick up trash, which is absolutely valuable, and like great, like that's better than nothing. What if you can look in your company, say, or in your community and spot a situation where there's unnecessary plastic used, right? It's just like, oh, it's like double, triple wrapped in plastic. Absolutely doesn't make sense, and that's necessary. And you make the one-time effort to change that. And then every single time this otherwise would have been produced with double, triple wrapping, you have passive impact. You change the system and you change the trajectory. And it's like ding, 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 like you're sleeping and that was prevented, right? And again, it was prevented. And again, it was prevented. So I see that my way of doing it is with content. So the way that I do podcasts is pretty evergreen. Like people are still listening to the first episodes from 4 years ago. And that's also the reason why I want to get into film, because people still watch films which are 10 years old, 20 years old, 30 years old. Because in the end, I think we can have a positive influence, especially if we embrace the power that we can have in either creating long-lasting content or changing a system.
I totally agree. I think we come to solutions. You mentioned problems. People like to talk about problems, but I think solutions evolve out of conversations about problems. And having more people on podcasts like yours talking about problems, suggesting solutions, bringing it to more people, making more people think about the problem and the solution, makes more people going at the end of the day and then actually change the world. I think I totally agree to what you say.
Yeah, and same for you. Your content is also reaching people while you sleep, while you're at the beach. That's still impacting lives.
I think this is the big benefit out of the last 4 years, that the entire business-to-business industries were pushed towards social media, towards search engines, and now actively consume content. This is why I think it's so much fun and so helpful to produce content, have conversations with people like you who do a lot of groundwork in their areas of expertise and help people understand the world better.
Yeah, and thank you so much. It was a super, super enjoyable conversation. Yeah, the time flew by. 2 hours, like whoosh.
I totally agree. I would love to keep going, but maybe we can meet in 1 year or a couple of months and revisit the topics we were talking about. I would recommend your podcast. Thank you very much for your time and sharing your insights into the food industry.
Thank you as well, Christian.
Have a great end of the year and a great 2024.
You too.
See you. Bye.
See you. Bye-bye.
This conversation has shown that the future of food isn't just about feeding people, it's about feeding the planet itself, sustainably and resiliently. We explored how systems like agroforestry can mimic nature to rebuild ecosystems, why Europe's strict pesticide regulations set a global benchmark, and how creating passive impact can ripple through communities to spark lasting change. The challenge of building food systems that are both efficient and resilient has never been greater. But as we have seen today, disruption brings opportunity to rethink, innovate, and lead. From the power of systemic change to inspiring ideas like passive impact, Marina Schmidt has shown us the tools we need to make meaningful progress. If you believe in these ideas and want to spread the message, there is one simple step you can take. Like, comment, and share this episode. Together, we can grow this show to attract even more visionary speakers. Let's make food not just about sustenance, but about creating a healthier, more sustainable world. Thank you for listening, and remember, every small change we make today is shaping the future we all want to live in. Until next time, keep thinking big, stay curious, and let's move forward together.